Good evening, everybody. You are all very, very welcome. My name's Jan Royall, and I happen to be chairing the first part of this panel event this evening because Perran is voting, as he jolly well should be, as a good supporter of the government. So I think we are still waiting for people to be admitted. Shall I begin properly? I'm asking Jacob, who is our
Yes, you can do
maestro.
properly.
Okay, so um, a very warm welcome, as I said. I've got a few housekeeping issues that I've been asked to say. So the meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel in due course. So if you don't want to be seen, please do turn your camera off. That is absolutely fine. I understand that Brussels Labour is holding a watch party this evening. So a very warm welcome to Brussels Labour, with lots of our friends working in Brussels. In the chat, Jacob is going to put a link with which, if you're not yet a member of LME, you could join, and I would urge everybody to join if they're not already members. And when we get to the Q&A, whoever's chairing, me or Perran at that time, we will ask you to raise your hand, your virtual hand, and then you'll be able to ask your question because Jacob will be able to unmute you. So with that, we're going to begin our meeting this evening. So each of the speakers is going to make a short introduction, 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. So I'm first of all going to call on my friend, Julie Lawrence, who is the chair of Chippenham CLP. She's the vice chair of the South West Board of the Labour Party. And importantly, in this evening's context, she is the South West representative for LME. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Jan. It's great to see you all, and hello, Brussels. It's great that you've joined us. So in the short time we have, I'm just going to talk in general terms about what Europe means for the Southwest region and progressing the UK-EU reset. So for the Southwest, I think there's 5 key sectors across our region that have been impacted by Brexit, and in turn will hopefully be beneficiaries of the reset. So, of course, firstly, we've got our big university sector in the Southwest with over 150,000 students across 10 universities. So following successful negotiations, we are returning to the Erasmus Plus scheme, which is great. And additionally, the government is negotiating a youth experience scheme with the EU to allow young people to move to the EU to work, study, or travel for a fixed period of time. And hopefully, those negotiations will be progressing positively. Secondly, aerospace and defence. For example, Bristol's economy has been built substantially on aeronautics, with companies such as Airbus, Rolls-Royce's military division, and BAE Systems in Filton. And thanks to the efforts of Swindon North's MP, Will Stone, and others, we're now seeing drone manufacturing in Wiltshire, in Swindon. Aerospace and defence is arguably the region's most EU integrated sector, so frictionless supply chains and mutual recognition of regulatory standards are crucial. And despite some setbacks, the government is pursuing defence industrial cooperation with the EU. And this week it announced a new joint defence financing and procurement programme with Finland and the Netherlands. Turning to agriculture and farming, Southwest dairy, food and agricultural exports have faced significant friction since Brexit, with UK exports to the EU falling by 21%. And the government is negotiating a deal which aims to allow UK products like processed meats and dairy back into the EU market to move freely by cutting red tape to work towards establishing an SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary agreement on food safety and animal and plant health. And this will remove the need for border checks, extra paperwork and costs on businesses for the vast majority of food, drink, plant and animal products. Now, it doesn't mean that the UK will align with, it does mean that the UK will align with EU rules on food and drink, but we will have a role in shaping them and will have access to the relevant EU databases. Now, on fishing, as we know, Cornwall and Devon have historically significant fishing industries, and the UK exports approximately 80% of its fishing catches, of which 70% by value goes to the EU. So it's a really large amount of export there. And according to the UK and a change in Europe, UK fishing exports to the EU fell 29% by volume from 2019 to 23. So an SPS deal will also come as a boost to the fishing industry. And then there is the fifth sector is the renewable energy sector, and the Southwest is really setting the standards there. We've got a growing and diverse renewable energy sector, including offshore wind, nuclear power, and geothermal and heating solutions. And one example of progress with our European neighbours is an agreement to greatly increase offshore wind capacity as part of the shared goal of massively scaling up offshore wind by 2050 and lowering energy prices. So the UK really should encourage those relationships with the EU and European nations where we can. I just want to turn briefly to what is going on this week around the UK-EU reset, where Nick Thomas-Symonds, Cabinet Minister for EU Relations, and his team are working hard in progressing negotiations ahead of the summit on 19th of May. No doubt concentrating his mind and that of Rachel Reeves is the fact that lost tax revenue arising from Brexit is, according to OBR figures, around £40 billion every year. So it's vital these negotiations are successful. And this is all against a backdrop of the meeting of February's Munich Security Conference, where Keir Starmer was warmly received when he said, "We are no longer the Britain of the Brexit years anymore." And our own LME chair, Stella Creasy, has also been in Brussels this week as part of a parliamentary delegation that scrutinises the Brexit deal. And she's urged our government to go bigger to get the current negotiations across the line to the benefit of both the UK and the EU. And she emphasised that means making an offer to the European Union that goes beyond just a wish list of the extra things that we want, but also takes into account what they want and is respectful of EU members' natural caution arising from the damage of Brexit. And I believe Nick got the message when he said that it was time to put the foot on the accelerator. And it was encouraging to hear Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday, where she blamed Brexit for doing deep damage to the UK economy and said she wants to further align with the single market and will await the details with interest. So I think with such continued engagement this week, I'm hopeful that we can get some good progress in the coming months. And then I just want to say that finally, as Labour Party and LME members, I believe we need to use our voices to put the EU reset further up our agenda of priorities, as so much else follows, not least the cost of living, opportunities for young people and climate. So I think we should advocate strongly for closer alignment, and I'd be interested to hear my fellow panelists and your views about how we can take that forward. We know that with everything going on in the world and the tension that currently exists in our relationship with the United States, that our relationship with our nearest neighbours in Europe has never mattered more for trade, national security and peace. So thanks very much.
Thank you. It's absolutely fabulous, a great start, and a really very broad overview. And now we're going to hear from Emily Pomroy-Smith. Emily is the Vice Chair of Bath and West Co-op. She's the Chair of Southwest Wiltshire CLP, but here this evening she's also going to speak as an award-winning entrepreneur who clearly has much to lose from Brexit this evening.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you, Julie, for that really insightful contribution there. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. It's really lovely to see such a full webinar on a Wednesday evening. So I'm here, as Jan said, in my capacity as a Southwest-based business owner and award-winning entrepreneur. And I just wanted to give a little bit of colour and a little bit of experience about what it's actually been like dealing with the Brexit cliff edge, and how that has impacted my business personally, but also other small businesses in the Southwest. So I'm just going to give a quick definition because I think it's important to, I'm going to speak in acronyms and I don't like doing that without actually making sure that they're accessible and that everyone understands what they are. So obviously, small and medium-sized enterprises or SMEs make up 99% of the UK businesses, and that's about 5.7 million businesses across the UK. But an SME, which is a small business, is actually a business that has typically less than 50 employees and turnover of under 10 million. Micro businesses, which is actually, I think, possibly what most people would think of as a small business, are firms that have fewer than 10 employees and a turnover of under 2 million. So I have what is classed as a micro business. And the Southwest in particular is characterised by high numbers of freelancers. We have a huge creative industry in the Southwest. In Perran's constituency in particular, there's a fantastic local artist scene. And, we also have a lot of home-based businesses, and that has obviously grown since COVID. And obviously in the Southwest, we have a large amount of agricultural businesses that are also sort of classed as SMEs and micro businesses. I founded BamBonn in 2020, unintentionally coinciding with the start of the pandemic. It wasn't actually, it was all planned and ready to go before the end of March 2020. But I fortunately was able to make that work. And it's an online business, e-commerce, direct to consumer. And I started with the intention of shipping worldwide because I knew that there was a global demand for the product that I created. And it was important to me that I could open it up to as many people as possible. It repeatedly went viral out on social media. It's a hair product. You're more than welcome to look it up afterwards. It's very niche and very specific. However, it did do incredibly well and far better than I had anticipated. And by the end of 2020, my EU custom made up around 35% of my annual business, which was a really, important part of my customer base. Being able to have that seamless trade with the EU, and at that point, we were able to ship over to the Europe without any additional charges or additional costs. And thank you very much for popping the link in the chat there for my business. So thank you. So then what happened is obviously we had the cliff edge of the Brexit deal, and suddenly my EU consumers were refusing their shipments because what was happening was that they were then being hit with customs charges and VAT charges and the uncapped fees that were being charged by customs by the delivery companies, which meant that what should cost them 15, £20 was doubled in cost, and they were getting these unexpected bills. So there was a pain point there where there was a little bit of time where people would just refuse the deliveries and I'd just get them sent back to me and I'd have to refund them in full, including shipping, because that is our consumer right and we have to do that as a business. So you have to swallow the cost. Even if you've already paid for the shipping, you don't get that back from Royal Mail or who you're sending that with. And then people sort of started to get used to it and they adjusted, similar to, if you order something from the US now, we know that we get a customs bill that comes through before we're able to get it if it's over a certain value. And that seemed to sort of work okay for a while. And then we had more regulations that came in. And so one of the things that happened was that there was a scheme that was brought in called the IOSS, which is the International One-Stop Shop, which meant that businesses were able to trade more seamlessly with the EU, where EU customers could pay the fees in advance, and then the business would be able to remit those fees to the EU country that they were shipping to, the relevant taxes. And it meant that they then didn't have to pay the customs fees that would be going through and the processing fees through the delivery company. The issue is that for a website that is set up to deal with the IOSS, the International One-Stop Shop, it costs around £20,000 for a business to be able to set that up. And then you have the annual fees on top of that, which are another £3,000 to £5,000. So for most small businesses and most micro businesses and small ones as well, that is a cost of doing business that makes it prohibitive. I fortunately had a product that was eligible to be able to go on to Etsy, onto the Etsy marketplace, and they are part of the IOSS, and therefore they can actually do that on my behalf. So I was able to continue shipping to my EU customers via Etsy, but it did take a while for that to get set up. And what happens is that they then pay the relevant VAT, and then that gets remitted to the country that they ship it to. And then there were more regulations that came in. So now we also have packaging regulations that unfortunately it's not a universal system across the European Union, which means that I have to pay membership fees and annual fees for recycling the packaging that I put onto the EU market. So I send everything in recyclable cardboard packaging, small boxes that go through your letterbox, and I have to pay per weight every year to Germany, to France, to Austria, to Spain, a fee, and different ones, and different companies, and different things. So you think the administration that adds on to that, and what a lot of small businesses did is they just stopped. They just stopped because there was no benefit to doing that. It has made it harder and harder and harder to do that, and we are facing yet more changes this year. One of the things that has also been brought in now is that you also have to have an EU representative as a business. So that was something that I actually stopped for a while, shipping to the EU for over a year, and the revenue that it cost my business was staggering. But it also means that you lose the potential future customers as well, because the whole point of it is that if someone goes to buy your product and then they can't, they go elsewhere. They're not going to come back to you in a year's time when suddenly you've managed to iron out the kinks and have got it sorted. And the EU representative, it's normally on a product base number. So I pay for 5 different product lines to be able to be shipped to the EU, and I pay £500 a year to have an EU representative in the EU. If we were still a member state of the EU, I, as the business owner, would be my EU representative. So I wouldn't be paying that. And that's, just to sort of give you kind of like all the additional barriers that have suddenly we're currently navigating, but we're also now dealing with a global crisis that, we have tariffs that have been introduced with the US that are being introduced and then not introduced and then changed. And so, small businesses are really, really struggling. Most small businesses fail within the first 2 years. And it is something that is only going to get worse. And what we really, really need is to be able to open up the market again and actually be able to have that frictionless trade where we are able to benefit because it means that we have access to our closest neighbours. And as a small business, we are risk takers. It's something that you have to do. And in the Southwest, we have so much opportunity and so much creativity, and entrepreneurship is something that we should be nurturing and encouraging. And if we're restricting the markets in which we can trade, it's only going to make that harder. So thank you very much. And I'll pass back to Jan, but I really look forward to speaking later with you.
Emily, thank you so much. I mean, that was deeply, deeply depressing. I mean, all of us sitting around this virtual table, we will all have been tearing our hair out, will we not, about the fact that there was Brexit. But I mean, that is just madness, sheer and utter madness. And as you say, we've got so many opportunities, so many entrepreneurs, so many creative people in the Southwest, and still unable to do what they should and want to be able to do as individuals, but also for our economic growth. So Nick Simmons, in the Times on Monday, he's talking about all this extra bureaucracy, and he called it a paperwork tax. But it also has, as we all know, a cost of living penalty on all of us because it's stymieing the growth of our economy in the UK. But my God, how can people have been in favour of Brexit, knowing what, you think that everybody would want to change their mind, wouldn't you? Anyway, we'll get to questions in a minute. I just want to say a few things global geopolitical terms, because I think we're being bombarded, are we not, at the moment? It's extraordinary. We've got.
Jan, sorry, just to interrupt you, your microphone is a bit faint at the moment.
My microphone is faint. Where is it? It's probably My microphone was faint because it's around the back of my head. Is that better? I'm so sorry. Essentially, what I was saying about Emily, she's an extraordinary young woman, and that we need more Emilys, but fewer people are going to want to do what Emily's been doing so bravely because of what Nick Simmons called this paperwork tax and all the obligations that, having left the EU, that are now put on small businesses and entrepreneurs like Emily. But Emily, I can assure you that we'll all go out and we'll sign up to BamBonn, because I think we all probably need it after all this. Anyway, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the sort of geopolitical situation and how it affects us and the EU. Because as we all know, we're living in a dangerous and chaotic world where the old rules-based order no longer holds. And I think that makes our relationship, our partnership with the EU even more important. The EU has always mattered for our economy, and I believe for peace, because I'm very old, but from the very beginning, when we joined the European Union, for me, it was a project which was to do with prosperity, but also to do with peace. But since the invasion of a country on our continent, I think it becomes clearer and clearer by the day that cooperation with our European partners is critical for our defence. And this is even more urgent now, given Trump's unpredictable and irresponsible actions. I could say a lot more about that, and I would be very rude, but I will restrict my comments for the moment. But I mean, from Venezuela to Greenland, and now his illegal war in Iran, which is devastating the country, and it's having a profound impact on countries in the region. Undoubtedly, it will drive migration. And of course, it's damaging the global economy, and the impact on our cost of living and the cost of living in other countries that are affected can only get worse. And I'm very proud that Keir stands firm with our European allies, refusing to be drawn into an offensive war. Trump doesn't seem to understand that NATO was established to be a defensive organization, to try to prevent wars, not to start wars. Earlier on this evening, I was at a meeting, in fact, with John Healey, and he was very positive about our relationship with our EU partners, including, of course, in terms of defence. And he said that it's widely acknowledged, and people are delighted that we now have a pro-European government that takes its defence and foreign policy obligations very seriously. And in fact, we are leading on many issues in relation to defence. Of course, the politics around Brexit is shifting. And not so very long ago, as we will all remember, discussing the economic impact of Brexit was discouraged in some way, including in our own party. But now the government is much more open, and Rachel Reeves has repeatedly highlighted the costs of Brexit. And in the May's lecture yesterday, she signalled a move towards a deeper economic and security ties with Europe, grounded in our shared values. And I think that makes for real progress in terms of our reset. And I think we should all be very proud. Last night, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who is he's centre-right himself, and he is the European leader who is closest to Donald Trump. But he compared Brexit to chopping off your foot for absolutely no reason. And he said that we should rejoin the EU, but he recognised that this would take time. And in the meantime, he urged the EU and UK to deepen cooperation in defence, intelligence, trade and innovation. And this dovetails exactly with the Chancellor's argument that closer alignment is in our security interests, especially as Russian aggression continues. And we know that Russia's also got its paw prints, not just in Ukraine, but it's got paw prints all over what's happening in Iran. And, we're all subject to the disinformation and bots which are coming out of Russia. So the government is now considering joining a 90 billion loan program for Ukraine. And of course, it is cooperating with European and NATO partners, including new mechanisms with countries such as the Netherlands and Finland. Rachel emphasised that Britain's strength rests on strategic alliances and that our fate is inescapably bound with Europe. She acknowledged the deep damage caused by Brexit, higher trading costs and an estimated 8% hit to our GDP. And she noted that US and Indian trade deals simply cannot replace Europe because Europe accounts for half of our trade. However, I'm sad to say that some, domestic Brexit wounds remain. And so Rachel set out national interest principles for any renewed alignment, delivering long-term growth and jobs, ensuring stable, compatible policy direction, and strengthening UK economic and national security. And if met, she believes that such alignment should be long-term and durable. And it's very good that the CBI welcomed her approach. Of course, we should always remember that negotiations have two sides. And my friend Anna Menon, who is Director of UK in a Changing Europe, suggested in an article this week that the EU might not be very enthusiastic about alignment, or not all members of the EU, considering it to be cherry picking. So I'm really glad to hear from you, Julie, that this week in Brussels, Stella recognised that we have to remember that whatever our desires, changes must benefit both the UK and the EU if they're going to work. So I think that our partnership with the EU is, it's the most important partnership we could have. And I know that quite rightly, we have to think about our relationship with the US, but as has been demonstrated over the last days, months, weeks, when you've got somebody who announces in the middle of the night his foreign policy on Truth Social and doesn't seem to take advice from any of his own advisors, let alone other leaders in the world, at the moment, I think that relationship is extremely difficult and we rely more and more on our European partners. So I'm very glad that whilst we have always, not always, because I'm very old, but I mean, for a long time, we have been a pro-European party. And I think that as the days and weeks go on, that is going to be even more so. And I think that, all the polls tell us that more and more people in our country are understanding the benefit of membership or being close to the European Union. And more people are saying, oh my goodness, why did we embark on this nightmare of Brexit? So we've got to have hope, have we not? It's the world is in such a desperate situation at the moment, but we have to have hope. And I think that one means of having hope is to deepen and strengthen our partnership with Europe. So that's it from me. I don't know if Perran is here yet. Is he here?
I am.
Oh, you are. Hello, Perran. How lovely to see you. Well, I'm going to hand over to you as chair, and you are also going to give us some words, pearls of wisdom, and then you'll open it up to questions. Over to you.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for that. And firstly, profuse apologies to everybody. I was a few minutes late because we were voting down some Tory nonsense in the Commons. So you have to forgive me for that. So my name's Perran Moon. I'm the MP for Camborne, Redruth and Hale. I am officially the furthest southerly Labour MP in the UK. but not the furthest westerly, because the UK is on a tilt, and my colleague Torquil Crichton in the Outer Hebrides has claimed that position as being further west marginally than Camborne, Redruth, and Hale. In Cornwall, we have 6 constituencies. All 6 were Conservative before the last election. We have only ever elected, prior to the last election, 4 Labour MPs, and at the last election, Cornwall voted 4 more. So we now have 4 Labour MPs and 2 Liberal Democrat MPs in Cornwall. Look, thank you very, very much for joining. I'm going to make my comments quite short because I'm conscious of time, and I suspect people will want to be asking a few questions. I am going to just particularly thank our friends from Brussels for joining for joining today. So thank you very much for coming along. But I'll start by stating the bleeding obvious, which is that the impact of Brexit that it's had on the UK, and I'm going to talk specifically around Cornwall, is profoundly and deeply troubling. In terms of the UK overall, it's been probably stated already, the OBR continues to state that the medium-term impact of Brexit will be in the order of 4% of GDP, and there's plenty of other economists who suggest that that is significantly higher. In Cornwall, 99% of our businesses are SMEs. Emily alluded to SMEs earlier. So we are very, very exposed, and we need to do much more to support our SMEs within Europe. But if you pick a sector, there is a profoundly negative impact. So if we look at the overall picture, Europe recognised Cornwall's unique position and kind of dispersed deprivation, and allocated Cornwall, the European Union allocated Cornwall Objective 1 funding. And that was specifically invested into infrastructure, and that was £100 million a year that the Leave campaign promised would be matched when we left the EU. Well, it's just yet another one of their lies, because it didn't. But then if we look at it by sector, if you look at digital inclusion, we're already starting to feel the impact of underinvestment in this area. As digital connectivity has moved from 6th in the business priority list to 3rd in Cornwall. So it is really, really having a negative impact. And then if you look at the agricultural community, the package of measures and incentives offered to the farming community since Brexit has been a fraction of what was available when we were in the European Union. 70% of arable farmers, 68% of cattle, dairy and sheep farmers, 81% of vegetable farmers, and 79% of pig farmers, and these are farmers, have said Brexit has had a negative impact on their business. And the farming community, not exclusively, but the farming community was one of the communities that voted quite heavily to leave the European Union. So there are some quite profound impacts that have happened, and the main reasons for the impact on agriculture are the increased input costs, similar to some of the challenges that Emily's just been describing, decrease in subsidies, but an massive increase in export costs. And what the government is trying to do is continuously seek to improve this situation. I will say that it wasn't just the fact that we left the European Union. The nature with which we left the European Union caused some quite difficult scars to overcome. And this government has set itself on a journey to repair a lot of the damage that was done in rebuilding relationships with the EU. But these kind of increased costs then link into another area that's important in Cornwall, the hospitality industry. And there were increases in costs of food, which resulted in a serious impact in hospitality, with costs being passed on to consumers. But the price increase tolerance of consumers has pretty much reached its limits. And then we must not forget that 25% of the hospitality workforce was made up of EU nationals. And this has obviously taken a rapid and sharp decline. And it's estimated that a third of pubs and restaurants have reduced their operating times as a result, meaning in Cornwall we have more ghost villages and less revenue coming into the industry. And then if we look at tech and creative, and Emily mentioned creative as well, the uncertainty around access to the Horizon Fund, the greater friction for EU developers to work in Cornish tech businesses, and the EU seed and scale-up funding has rapidly declined, which has made it really tricky and at times stagnant tech and creative sectors. So we're very much focused in those areas as well. But the challenge above, over and above all of this is the politics, as I mentioned, and it's not just that we left the EU. It's the kind of the manner in which we departed, and trust was really blown at that point. And there was very little incentive for EU leaders to help a country that has left the club to flourish economically. It would have been counterproductive. And that's a really dangerous place that we inherited from the Conservatives. But we are making progress. I'm a delegate to the Council of Europe, and I often meet members of parliaments from across Europe, and it's almost like a breath of fresh air for them, because they're able to engage in a productive, respectful dialogue with the British government, which simply didn't exist before. And that's backed up by right the way through the leadership. And as mentioned in her May's lecture yesterday, the Chancellor talked about responsibility and a plan to build prosperity. And she described Brexit as a chaotic wrong turn. And I was pleased to see that we're exploring a new mechanism with the Netherlands, Finland, the EU, and other NATO partners to collaborate on defence procurement. But my priority is to kind of ensure that system level negotiations have a positive impact on both businesses and people right across Cornwall and southwest England. And I'm really keen to hear from you, to take any questions that you have. I'm not going to, because I'm conscious of time, I'm not going to take up too much more time. But if you do have any questions, then now's the time to start raising your electronic hands, or any kind of statements you want to make. If they can be relatively short and succinct, then we'll manage to get more people in. But I'm just wondering if anyone wants to say anything or ask anything at this point. Who's going to be first to ask? No? Well, I'll ask a question then of Emily. Emily, you've really accurately described the situation since Brexit, and I'm keen to understand what, a horrible expression, but what good looks like for you, accepting that we can't wake up tomorrow morning and join the European Union. That's just not feasible at this stage. But I'd be really interested to know from you what would be an ideal next few steps to be making to improve your business's opportunities.
Thank you, Perran. I really appreciate that. And I think that the first thing, and I know it's a really big ask, and this is the one that I think is the one that would make the most significant thing, is about the customs union, because that is the thing that will, it's already estimated that would unlock around up to 4% of the annual GDP in this country, which is about £15 billion more than that. So that would benefit SMEs and micro businesses across this country, and directly, obviously, improve our economy. I think one of the things that always happens with this sort of thing is that, especially for larger businesses, there's a lot of support, and they are able to get the legal advice, and they're able to invest in those things. So I am one of the Small Business Britain F Entrepreneur ISO 100 winners from last year, and the work that Small Business Britain has been doing on working with the Department of Trade to actually break down some of the logistical barriers and explain, what needs to happen. I mean, when we had the issue with the EU representatives, for example, there was a lot of misinformation. The deadline suddenly came up and no one had actually really knew that it was happening. So there were businesses that actually fell foul of the new regulations unintentionally because the publications weren't really there. It wasn't really made clear for everyone. And I think that a lot of this is about actually, when these things are happening, we need to actually still be working with the EU on those things, because if they're going to bring in these regulations, we need to still be knowing about it, because if we're not actually aware of it, we end up falling foul of that, and there are significant fines, there are penalties for non-compliance, and then you end up with certainly very small businesses who don't have the resources, are going to fail in that regard. So definitely, I would think, customs union would be ideal, please and thank you. But certainly, when these things are happening, there needs to be a system where we are actually actively working with the EU to make sure that they're changing their regulations, and we have to adapt and do something quicker and make sure that that is publicised widely.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emily. That's a really, really good point, and it's that point about stability and kind of prior notice as to what's happening, so businesses can adapt. I've spoken to businesses in and around my constituency who say they've almost baked in now all of the new processes and the paperwork, and they're almost fearful in a way of change again. But it is something that we will be working, or we are working very aggressively towards. There are a few comments in the chat. Yes, Jerome, I totally agree with you. The Babcock's opportunity at the naval base at Davenport is a huge opportunity, and that will inevitably has to lead to closer cooperation with our European partners and allies. And before I take your question, Jerome, I think the Brussels Labour have got a comment that they would like to make. So without sounding like somebody from the Eurovision Song Contest, come in, Brussels.
Okay, can you hear Brussels?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. We're having a few little technical problems at this end as well.
How many points are you going to allocate to the last song? No, sorry, wrong song. Sorry.
We've got quite a few comments at this end, but I was trying to get the computer to work, so I'll go first with mine, which is not about Erasmus Plus, but about the situation of continental teenagers and anybody that wants to go to a British university. And maybe it's really a question for Jan, given her experience in Oxford. But I mean, I was talking to the parent of a Dutch teenager the other day, and they're talking about a €50,000 per year fee to go to a British university, which is absolutely amazing. When everybody knows that the idea of integrating different nationalities together in seminars and lectures is positive for everybody involved. Do you think there's any possibility of getting British universities, and it's not just a government problem, I recognise it's also a university problem, because of course universities need the resources and need the revenue from international students. But do you think there's any chance beyond Erasmus, this is not an Erasmus question, is there any way to do something on university fees for European students?
Jan, yeah. I think that was, sorry, yes, Jan.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You're right, it is appalling, prohibitive, and can you hear me? And terrible for EU students who now wish to study in the UK. And it depends on the university and it depends on the course. But I know, for example, that I recall finding out about an undergraduate who wanted to study English at Oxford, and it was going to cost, the fees were going to cost £30,000 a year, which, I mean, ridiculous, mad, and wrong. You say that it's nothing to do with Erasmus, but as you may have seen, the EU are now trying to link the negotiations about Erasmus, or no, trying to link the mobility scheme, not Erasmus Plus, we're there and that's fine, but link the mobility scheme, which is being discussed, to tuition fees for students from the EU. So we'll have to see what happens there. I mean, it does represent a big hit to UK universities and to some extent to the Treasury. It ain't going to be easy, but of course, my heart goes out to all kids who want to study in the UK. And it's so important that they should be able to, no matter what their background, they should be able to come to the UK. It's good for them, but it's also good for British universities. And we do need that communication between our kids from all different countries, and we are missing that because the number of young people who come to British universities from the EU has gone down exponentially. Of course, sorry, one last thing is that there are the number of places that have been allocated for foreign students has remained the same, but instead of EU students, we have students coming from other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Jen. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
you. Our
you.
microphone is still open at this end, and I'm sorry, as it's still open, could I just introduce Keir to ask the next comment or next question or comment from Brussels?
Yes, sure, Keir.
Keir Fitch, very long-standing member of Brussels Labour. I mean, of course, we've been talking about EU policy as is, but one thing that I'm sure you're aware of is the European Industrial Accelerator Act that we adopted, I think, just this week, which, as part of the growing global protectionism, is very much looking at insisting on Europe-made components, etc. And I think, I mean, this is something that you have to factor into the UK debate. I mean, I know the UK is well aware of it and desperately trying to be part of it, but I think it's yet another reason why actually the UK has to be very close to Europe. Otherwise, we simply will not be anywhere in the world because we're not part of the European bloc, because we're not made in Europe. We're certainly not part of the made in US bloc or the made in China bloc. So I think, I mean, the fundamental question is, I mean, in the end, we're back to the argument about cherry picking. And I mean, is there anything left by the time we said we want more people to work in hospitality, etc.? We want all the elements of actually taking the European rules. We haven't discussed services. We've been talking about business, about goods, but I mean, actually the service industries have been very hard hit. If you look at the arts, even lawyers, accountants, etc. So, I mean, in the end, is there anything left where the UK doesn't want to be part of Europe? And if we get to that point, why are we playing games around sort of trying to renegotiate some very complex deal? And why don't we actually say, let's come back in as one of the three biggest economies and one of the three biggest countries and actually play the role that the UK ought to be playing? I mean, I know the politics was difficult, but the politics has changed. So why don't we just bite the bullet and say, actually, that's where we should be? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so really, really interesting comments there. I'll take those 3 points quite quickly. The first one, I worked in the automotive industry for 30 years before I became an MP, and there are particular issues around rules of origin and the car manufacturing industry that are going to have that we're working through at the moment, and they are complex, as you described, complex areas. But I'm hopeful that we can reach agreement, and we've had some positive re-engagement with the EU across that. Would have been much more difficult under the previous government. You make an excellent point about arts, and obviously we talked about musicians and the terrible problems that our musicians had in travelling, but also the reason that I was very pleased about Erasmus Plus is that I benefited, and I expect probably many people here benefited from that free movement. And I feel particularly ashamed that so much of that opportunity has been deprived from our young people to work, live, and love in mainland Europe. Because of a decision that was, let's face it, frankly taken by older people, and yet a lot of those young people now who were not even 10 years old when the Brexit referendum happened are being penalised for that. So I feel particularly uncomfortable about that. And so, I think there is a long way to go, but we are making rapid progress. And your point about, going through these things piecemeal, it comes back to that point, which is really, I hadn't appreciated this before I became an MP, but actually engaging at a political level with EU partners. Yes, there's a massive amount of goodwill. They are so pleased with the re-engagement, but there are still scars. It's not in the European Union's interest for a country to leave the European Union and then really prosper, because otherwise there are risks in other countries that have a strong leave lobby. And so I think that we are making progress. I know it's not as quick as many people would like, but you just have to listen to what Rachel Reeves said yesterday, and the clear direction of travel is a much closer relationship with the European Union. And I take the challenges and around the single market and the customs union and free movement. We are working through a whole load of quite complex areas. But we are working through at pace, and there is real government will to work as quickly as we possibly can. And I have to say, in the main, support from the European Union as well. There's a few questions that have come into the chat.
Can I just add
yes.
one little thing?
Yes, sure, Jan.
Which is the link between people who are against the European Union and populism. Not so much anymore in this country, though it's there, but it's all over it's all over in European countries. Therefore, one can understand why some member states might be reluctant just to say, come back in, because they're fighting populism in their own countries. And I think our democracy is truly being undermined throughout the European Union by populists, and we do have to be careful.
We do, but what I would say to that is, in a really perverse way, look at the UK. We need to hold ourselves up as to exactly what happens to your economy and your society if you leave this club. There is no question. There are very, very, very few people now who still think Brexit was a good idea. It's been deeply, deeply damaging, both to the economy and to UK society. And if you look at the polls, yes, the populists, we have our own populists in the UK, but the bare facts are that we have suffered enormously by leaving the European Union, and we need to say, don't make the mistake that we made. Because that's what where you end up. I'm conscious of time.
Can I just say one thing on that?
Yes, Julie. Yes.
Let's not forget that Reform are advocating for an even harder Brexit, severing all remaining ties with the EU. So the stakes are that high. It could get even worse under Reform.
It could get worse under Reform, and it's not just the EU. It's the Council of Europe and the European Convention of Human Rights, which both Reform and the Conservatives want to leave. And there are huge numbers of unintended consequences of doing that, not least those absolutely basic rights that are enshrined in law, and which affect us all even now. And so, when it comes to Reform and the Conservatives, they're excuse my language, they're two cheeks of the same arse. When it comes to the when it comes to the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I know that the Council of Europe is a different organisation from the European Union, but obviously there's a lot of overlap between those organisations. There are questions in the chat. There's one about improvement in transport infrastructure from Jerome. Yes, 100% agree. It's not just train lines in and out of Cornwall, which are knackered every time the wind blows and we get a storm. We've got one A road that goes in and out all the way down to my constituency. It's also we have one airport, one regional airport now. Notwithstanding all of the environmental impacts of flying, we do need our regional airports, and the government's investing over 100 million pounds into Cornwall. Well, that's all very well, but if we haven't got the infrastructure in place to support that investment, and that's digital connectivity as well as physical transport infrastructure, then we've got huge challenges with that as well. Look, I'm conscious of time, and I think we've run out of it because it's 8 o'clock. So unless anyone else has got anything to say, Julie, Emily, Jan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm sure you're members of the LME. If you're not, please join. But it's a really important organisation. Within the Labour Party, but also within government, because if we have the support of this organisation, it helps with our lobbying. It helps with support for the causes which I think are all dear to all of us. So thank you in particular to the folks from Brussels who are looking at their screen closely at the moment. And thank you all for joining. And it just remains for me to say have a good evening, and I hope to see you at one of these events again very soon. Thank you very much.